there are no journalistic institutions that function, but there are some journalists who still function, right? Sagar, Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, Cy Hirsch, right? These are all people who could potentially see the big picture and start following it. And because they're supported by comparatively independent, I don't know in Cy Hirsch's case, but in the other cases I mentioned, they're supported by their audiences, they could potentially stare down what will come back at them, right? But they're going to have to remember their skepticism. They're going to have to remember the conflicts of interest that sources have, and they're going to have to, ignore bad evidence, or bad information, no matter how authoritatively it's dressed, because journalism functions as one of very few checks on political and economic power. And it is obvious that whatever it is that has taken over our system is sort of loosely in the neighborhood of political and economic power, right? We don't know what it is, but we can see what it does. Certainly, I would say certainly the place to start, and the place, as you point out, the source of the virus is somehow more explorable than the other questions surrounding COVID, right? We did surprisingly well on that topic because people, I think, probably misunderstand how much still rests on the question. But at the point that some journalist or some set of journalists starts pursuing this, they're going to have to recognize that, if we again go back to the entire diagnosis of the system, right? We are living in something that is functioning like a dark age. We have to figure out, because much rests on, look, let's talk about the question of the origin of the virus more directly. If the virus came from nature, without human meddling, right? If it came through the wet market because somebody brought a wild animal there that had the virus and it jumped to people and created the pandemic, then that suggests, as we've discussed before on DarkHorse, that those who were rapidly working their way towards understanding these potentially pandemic viruses weren't fast enough, right? We didn't fund them enough. We didn't do enough gain-of-function research, right? Whereas if this escaped from the lab, then the exact opposite is true, right? If this is the result of our gain-of-function research program to study these viruses that were argued to be potentially pandemic starting, an argument that I think was way overdrawn, because jumping from nature across species barriers is far harder than they represented it. But if it turns out to have come from the lab, then the point is this is entirely a self-inflicted wound, the whole pandemic, right? And so everything hangs on that question, and it has to be nailed down. It cannot be, I feel like we're looking at the tobacco industry's playbook, right, of trying to muddle the evidence, right, trying to make it impossible to figure out what's true, so most people will simply move on. And the point is, how much damage has this done? Even if COVID were to disappear tomorrow, the disruption of our global system, right? The inability of supply chains to function, the fact that we have, labor shortages that make certain essential processes completely unreliable, right? That is all downstream of this one question. So it has to be studied. And likewise, the issue of, let's take, for example, the health consequence of the one remedy that was pushed on everyone.
Yeah.
This is not a difficult question, right? It is a noisy question, right? There's plenty of statistical noise in the impact of a particular remedy that was administered to billions of people. But it is a question that science is well positioned to answer relatively easily. We can't say what the consequence of those inoculations will be for people decades in, But we should have a rapidly accumulating body of evidence that says, what is the effect 1 year out? What is the effect 3 years out, right? That body of evidence should be accumulating, and we should be getting smarter as a result of it, right? This is something our university, this is the shallow end of the pool from the point of view of logic and study. This isn't technically difficult. This isn't statistically difficult. This is something. What you need is to compare groups, and you need to have large enough samples that you address the question of noise, and you figure out what the signal is. It should be easily done. And again, we're looking at something that is apparently not interested in the answer to that question, which I think then it leaves us at the following uncomfortable endpoint, which is, if our system is not interested in figuring out now what the consequences of its behavior were, that means that it is indifferent to the suffering and death of millions of people. If it is indifferent to the suffering and death of millions of people now, it is at least strongly possible that it was indifferent from the beginning, that it wasn't ever especially interested in protecting people. It was interested in doing something else that has never been shared with us. And so I think we have to ask, in light of the obvious evidence of cover-up that we've seen, the cover-up of the connection to the Wuhan lab, the cover-up in Fauci's emails, the cover-up of the harm to healthy young people who never should have been advised to get these inoculations in the first place, we have to ask the question, what did the architects of this policy know, and when did they know it, right? It's a traditional journalistic question. We have to follow the money, and we have to know what did they know, and when did they know it. And I will point out that there are certain things which would be decisive if we understood them. For example, did these people, when they got COVID, have access to repurposed drugs that they claimed didn't work, or didn't they?
Not did they have access, but did they use?
Did they use? Did they avail themselves of drugs that they advised others not to use? Did they get the vaccinations? Did they get the same ones that other people got? Did they get particular ones, right? Or didn't they, right? What did they know, and when did they know it? And I'm not claiming that we can access that information, that we can discover it, and I'm not claiming to know. But I think the point is, we've seen enough evidence that the trials revealed hazards of these inoculations, that it's not obvious that the people who pushed them hardest got the same shots as other people got. And a journalist should pursue that information, because if they didn't, then that would tell us that actually this was not a massive error that has been followed up by the indifference of these people, that it was in fact indifference to the suffering and death of strangers that existed from the beginning.